Thank you. Okay, first of all, I'd like to greet my indigenous greetings, Tashitelik from my native language. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are joining from. I'm Pema Wangmo Lama from Nepal, and today's moderator. First of all, I'd like to mark two important events today. The Second World Conference on Indigenous Women and 27th International Day of World Indigenous Peoples. I would like to welcome you all on the first day of the Second World Conference of Indigenous Women. Today, we are all here for the plenary session on the topic of effective, meaningful participation of Indigenous women with disability, for the topic on participating in decision-making spaces organized by NIDWAN. NIDWAN, National Indigenous Disabled Women Association Nepal, established in 2015, is an Indigenous women disabled-led organization which advocates for the rights of marginalized communities who face multiple and intersectional discrimination. Before we go on to the session, I would like to explain some technicalities and house rules we need to follow to avoid any interruption. Whoever are inside the Zoom room, I'd like to request everyone to keep yourselves mute unless you are making any intervention. Intervention is to be made during the Q&A session only. You are requested to post your questions and queries in the chat box, which will be responded to by our panelists, and please use respectful language respecting the diversity of the participants. Due to our time limitations, I would also like to request our speakers today to put forward their presentation and inputs within the time limit, which will be 5 minutes. Following the First World Conference on Indigenous Women, we have achieved numerous great achievements and has presented itself. The First World Conference on Indigenous Women has presented itself as a best practice, which has paved our way in the fight for our rights. Despite this, from the perspective of Indigenous women with disabilities, in the First World Conference of Indigenous Women, we failed to be inclusive to Indigenous women with disabilities. There are various other instances when Indigenous women with disabilities were not considered. In the COVID report published by FEMI, we forgot to integrate the issues and ground realities of Indigenous women with disabilities all over the world. In the report published by UN Special Rapporteurs, we again forgot to integrate and understand the narratives of Indigenous women with disabilities. So, while calling ourselves human rights defenders and human rights activists, we need to question ourselves. Are we looking at the rights of Indigenous women as basic rights? Whether our movements have just regarded them in a charity-based approach. So, yes, sure. So lack of participation and inclusion of Indigenous women with disabilities is evident in all levels, governing bodies, and even UN agencies. Looking at the global discourse of Indigenous movement, women movement, and person with disability movement, issues in context of Indigenous women with disability are always left behind. So, this Second World Conference on Indigenous Women is a historic moment for all of us to amend the limitations that First World Conference brought upon. And for this very purpose, we are all here with our four distinguished speakers and all the participants joining from the web interface and Zoom who have Zoom to be here in this collective movement. So I would like to welcome our four distinguished speakers who have been contributing to the Indigenous Peoples Movement and hear their opinions, experiences, and voices on best practices, challenges, and way forward in effective and meaningful participation of Indigenous women with disabilities in the decision-making spaces. About the context of our session, we will have 3 rounds in the session. First round will be the context setting from each speakers, who will have 5 minutes each, followed by question and answer session where our participants can put their questions and queries And finally, we will conclude our session by the recommendations from our speakers. Now, I would like to start our first round. To start our first round, I would like to welcome our first speaker, Ms. Pratima Gurung, on the floor. She is an academic activist from Nepal who has been instrumental in raising the voiceless voices of women, indigenous people, disability, and has been making remarkable in bridging multiple marginalized identities with an intersectional lens from Nepal, Asia, and globally. She is the president of National Indigenous Disabled Women Association Nepal, NIDWAN. Ms. Gurung is also a faculty member at Pattakania College, one of the single women colleges in Nepal. She is engaged in a she is engaged in research and links her academic research to advocacy. She also contributes as an expert of the Disability Nation Direction Committee formed by the Ministry of Women, Children and Senior Citizens of Nepal government. Pratima Gurung is also a founding member and currently General Secretary of Indigenous Person with Disabilities Global Network. Now, I'd like to request her to put forth the ground reality on lack of meaningful participation and documentation of Indigenous women with disability. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you, Pema. Thank you, moderator. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and indigenous greetings and blessings from my elders and ancestors and my Mother Earth. I wish the successful completion of the Second World Conference on Indigenous Women. And in this regard, I would like to thank the organizer, distinguished panelists, for accepting our invitations for this wonderful historic event. And I would also like to thank the organizer for providing this opportunity to NIDWAN to conduct this interactive session on the meaningful participation of women with disabilities in decision-making process. We all know that the First World Conference and the earlier conference, which has held before in terms of indigenous women, have paved path and accomplished many initiatives and progress on the rights of indigenous women. And they have played a very crucial role for equality, equity, and just society. Indigenous women also have shown their contributions in the family, in the society, and the country they live. And in this regard, I would say that indigenous women are the guardian of the Mother Earth and the indigenous values and systems that guides everyone us in a human right-based approach. All these efforts from the indigenous women's initiatives have done a greater achievements linking from a homogeneous group. All these efforts from the international labels still have to be internalized when I say that indigenous women are still considered as a homogeneous groups. So in this regard, I would also like to emphasize that today we are claiming our voices and we are making our position as a women with disabilities, because indigenous women are heterogeneous group. Today, we are girls, indigenous girls, youth, women with disabilities, children, elderly people, and LGBTI communities. So if you look at the global population, we are 54 million indigenous people with disabilities, 28 million indigenous women with disabilities, and 1.3 million in my country, Nepal, who have a distinct and multiple and intersecting identities that intersect, overlap, and generate a compounding forms of discrimination, social exclusion, marginalizations due to education, health, information, employment, and rehabilitations. We are struggling for our basic rights. And when we talk about the meaningful participation in decision making as indigenous women with disabilities, this narrative becomes a question to us every time at all the levels, within the home and outside the home, at both at public and private sphere, and also at the political sphere. So we share the same realities with our sisters, like the historical, systematic, structural discriminations, patriarchy, sexism, ableisms. These are our realities as a woman with disabilities. So if you look at the whole ground situation and the global phenomena also, from the 2011 of the Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network and the initiatives that we have done at the global level, I believe that these initiatives are just a starting point. These are just a dot, a small dot. And today we want to gather these dots as a collective voice to ensure the meaningful participation of women with disabilities. Because the study shows that 81% Indigenous people with disabilities are socially and economically impacted by the COVID pandemic, and 85% Indigenous women and girls, including women with disabilities, face violence, discriminations, and abuse. If you look at the global document, the UN Permanent Forum report in 2030, and the recommendations of the UN Permanent Forum from 2014 to 2021, the concluding observation of the CEDAW and CRPD, all these documents clearly outlines about Indigenous people in some references. But when it comes to women with disabilities, we still see a huge gap, missing of words for Indigenous women with disabilities. And when it comes to the participation in decision-making process, I would say that Indigenous women and Indigenous women with disabilities participations are invisible. They are nowhere. At the national level also, we are having our own struggles within ourselves. At the regional level and the global level, we are seeking our spaces to tell our sisters our challenges that we face as a woman with disabilities based on our impairment. Our sisters who are deaf cannot speak the language that I speak, so they need a sign language interpreter. Our sisters, they even cannot make a voice because they are intellectual disability. So how do we internalize this accessibility and the inclusion of women with disabilities is very much crucial. So I will just stop here and saying that in most of all the forums and platform, the question of meaningful participation of women with disabilities at the private sphere within the home, at the public sphere, at the country level, at the regional level, and at the global level has become invisible. And the Second World Conference is a space for us to bring this invisible voice into visibility and to ensure the meaningful and effective participation at all levels, from the government, from the Indigenous peoples organizations, from the development partners and funders, and all the relevant stakeholders who are working for the rights of human rights of all people, including Indigenous people. I will just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pratima Gulung, for your insightful presentation on lack of meaningful participation of Indigenous women with disability. I would like to thank you for keeping your presentation within the time limit. And I would like to request all our participants who are listening us to, if they have any questions for Ms. Pratima Guru and whatever she talked about, please post your questions in the chat box. It will be responded in the following question and answer session. Now, I'd like to welcome Ms. Kakai Tolentino on the floor. Ms. Kakai Tolentino is an indigenous Damagat woman in the Sierra Madre Mountain, northeastern part of Luzon Island, Philippines. She is a steering committee member of sub-regional and country focal person of Network of Indigenous Women in Asia, Newa, and national coordinator of By Indigenous Women's Network. She started her Indigenous people community work in the year 1980s when she was still youth doing community organizing among our brothers and sisters, forwarding and leading the campaign on Kauai Kaliwa Kanan Dam in the time of Marcos presidency until the time she was in National Secretariat of Katribu, former camp, as Organizational Development Program staff, performing the task in assistance of capacity building needs such as organizational assemblies and consolidation, assessment and planning. She is one of the founding members and delegates in the First National Congress of Katribu. Kalipong ng Katubong Mamamayan ng Filipinas in 1987. I'd like to request her to put forth her inputs on where and how do you see the meaningful participation and what is the situation of women with disabilities in the context of a country and how we can integrate them in the network of Indigenous Women of Asia, Newa's constituency. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Hello, good day to all on the Zoom and also the viewers on the FB Live. As the moderator introduced me, I'm Kakai Tolentino from the Philippines, and I will share my thoughts or views on how these Indigenous women with disabilities was integrated on the government system, policies, and program. So, in the Philippine context and present system of governance of the Duterte regime, in general, the indigenous peoples are not recognized as part of the Filipino constituency because of no census data of indigenous peoples' populations, as well the recognition as developer and defenders of ancestral lands and natural resources defenders within the territories of indigenous peoples. In this regard, indigenous women with disabilities in particular are always in the marginalized sector in Philippine society. No systematic program and services entitled for indigenous peoples, indigenous women, and especially for indigenous women with disabilities. And other side, as community of indigenous peoples, indigenous women with disabilities are mass people's movement, like Bayi Indigenous Women's Network, the Katribu Indigenous Peoples Organizations. We are responsible and creating space for the indigenous girls, children, and peoples with disabilities in our programs and community services. We recognize the skills and capabilities of peoples with disabilities, especially in the community, that they are with the peoples in the community in defense of the community people in time of natural and man-made disasters. They are involved in the community defense of the community people in time of the natural and man-made disasters. They are also with the defenders of land communities and resources. When the community put the people's barricade against the encroachment of any development projects like mining, construction of dam, plantation, against plantation, people with disabilities contributes their capacities to perform in any people's actions launched in their communities. They are also doing advocacy, networking in the community, in national and even in the international level as needed. Indigenous women with disabilities are also not spared from human rights violation perpetrated by the government forces, military, and the Philippine National Police through the anti-indigenous peoples policy government programs implemented by the government. Again, in this regard, indigenous mass movement is a matter in all causes. In gaining our history of struggles and identity as indigenous peoples, especially indigenous women and peoples with disabilities, youth and children, the only we have now is to assert, fight as decent of our rights to land, resources, dignity, and self-determination. No Indigenous women left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Kakai ma'am, for your very insightful inputs and shedding light on the efforts and strength of Indigenous women with disabilities and talking about the barriers created by the government, military, as said by you. If you have any questions, if any of our participants have any questions on Mrs. Kakai presentation and her inputs, please put in the chat box. It will be responded in the question and answer session. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ms. Carla Bosch on the floor. Originally from Puerto Cabezas, a northern Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, she is currently working with Pawanka Fund for Indigenous People as the Administrative Director, Donor Relations. She is an expert in social development programs in a multicultural context in the Caribbean coast and the Pacific of Nicaragua, Central America and Mexico, and Africa. In the, in the accompaniment to programs and projects that contributed to give the voice while reducing the structure that impoverish the less fortunate by building the capacity to implement their own self-determination for more than 25 years. She also worked at University of Caribbean Coast and the National University of Nicaragua in the fields of research, teaching, and advice on projects and programs for more than 5 years and worked with the Secretaría de Integración Centroamérica, SICA, as Executive Secretary for Tourism for 2.5 years. I would like to request her to put forth the perspective of developmental partners and respond on how can we include or ensure disability inclusion, be it access to sign language interpreter, personal assistant facility, support system, and funding and support to organization of women with disabilities from partners' perspective. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Good evening, good night, good morning to all. We're from different part of the world. It's really a pleasure to be here. First of all, I just wanted to say that I work for Pawanka, and Pawanka is an Indigenous-led organization created in 2014, and we have presence in the 7 sociocultural regions of the world. And we are led by 10 leaders, Indigenous leaders from the 7 sociocultural regions of the world. So I just wanted to put into perspective where I come from in terms of my work. And to answer clearly on how can we include disability, make it inclusions into our work as Pawanka, I would just say blunt, learning directly from them. Pawanka recognizes that Indigenous people with disability are vulnerable overall because there is limitation in catering for all their needs across in all the services. I'm not going to repeat. We had the previous speakers spoke about this. Pratima made a very good descriptions of all the different needs that the Indigenous disabilities people have. So I'm not going to make more explanation on that because it's already said and I second it and support it clearly. But we also, as Pawanka, would like to recognize the vulnerability that we have from the natural disasters, and they often live in these areas of risk related to climate change. We also recognize that the population of Indigenous people with disability among the poor is really, really high. Another important consideration that I would like to bring to the table is the lack of information available on Indigenous people with disability. We all know that this is very limited, and that we as Pawanka, we would like to make it clear that we are committed to support this process of Indigenous people with disability. So if we have done, what have we done so far? We have done a number of actions to be consequent with with our commitments. One of it, we are obviously, NIDWAN is one of our partners. That's why we're here supporting Pratima and her work. We have been working with Pratima for quite a while now, and we have learned a great deal from her, as she explained clearly. And we have also commissioned a consultant to provide us information about Indigenous people, disabilities in Latin America. And for that, we asked them to please provide us with a systematization of information of who is working in Latin America around these areas, to also provide us the effect of COVID in this sector, and to provide us a list of the organizations, if that's possible, obviously along with the challenges and lesson learned with COVID, so that we can bring this into our program. So we strongly believe that the key to ensuring disability inclusion starts by recognizing and understanding that partners' perspective come with the territory of the know how to solve the problems and to design their own development. We would like to incorporate strategies in our program that we could cater for this sector, obviously, as we've been doing it, and learn more and improve in this. So in this regards, I think Pawanka can have made a lot of changes in our program, and we have tailor-made our grant making process to meet all the needs that we have learned along the time. Therefore, Pawanka would start by recognizing that Indigenous people and their organization hold this, as I said, the know-how to solve their own problems. Our commitment, therefore, is to support the implementation of their initiative, to support the participation of our partners, to influence decision-making matters and that affect them, while ensuring the rights to base approach and social inclusion. We have done this in this regards. We have simplified, and I'm sure Pratima can second me in this. We have simplified our grant making process, our reporting process, to make sure that we could reach to the local without any problem, and access to those who otherwise can't make it, and have that link from the local to the global level. As I mentioned before, we do this in the 7 sociocultural regions of the world, and where there are presence of Indigenous people, and we begin doing this. The whole process starts from our guiding committee. They play a key role in this process in terms of accompaniment, mentorship, and reviewing the whole process of the request that comes to Pawanka for support. And as you know, we try to build a new model of intercultural philanthropy based on Indigenous values of reciprocity and complementary. And we try to build a respectful and trustful relationship with our partners. As I mentioned, NIDWAN, and I'll close with this, is one of our partners, strong partners in this, and they have taught us a lot. One of the things that they have taught us is how they have worked hard to promote critical issues at national, regional, and international level based on the information they have. And they have worked with women from all different sectors and the different Indigenous people, disabilities, and so on, to promote the work and to create synergy, and obviously to influence change in the policy makers level. I'll leave it to that so that you can ask me a question, because I think I just reached my 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Carla Bush, for your presentation. and we're staying within the time limit. I again like to thank you for highlighting on your efforts for motivating the inclusion of women with disabilities in your funding processes. And would again like to be, I'm very grateful that we as an organization have been able to be an example for you and your organization. Now, I'd like to request our participants, if you have any questions for Ms. Carla Bush, please post it in the chat box and that will be responded in the Q&A section. Now, I'd like to welcome our final speaker, Mr. Binota Moithamai, on the floor. Mr. Binota Moithamai is an indigenous Tripura Jamuma from the Chittagong Hill tracts of Bangladesh. He is an activist and advocate for the empowerment of indigenous peoples. He is currently the Vice Chair of United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People, which we shortly know as MRIP. And he is also former chair of Board of Trustee of the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. He is affiliated, among others, with Bangladesh Indigenous Peoples Forum, Asia Indigenous People Pact, AIPP, the International Network for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ESCR Net, to name a few. He is also serving as the member of UNESCO Global Task Force for making a decade of action for indigenous language. I would like to request him to put forth his inputs on being an emirate member. How can you play a role to ensure the meaningful participation of indigenous women with disabilities? The floor is yours, sir.
Krumkap, greetings in my language. And I'm sorry that I actually had a miscalculation about the time zone. So I'm a little late and I really missed the speeches from other speakers, which I'm really interested to hear very much. I'd like to thank you to the National Indigenous Disabled Women Association, Nepal, for having me to your side event today on the occasion of this International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, and to the Second World Conference on Indigenous Women and Women with Disabilities. I feel it's an honor and pleasure, privileges. The theme you have, as you have mentioned, participation in decision-making spaces, which you said effective and meaningful participation of Indigenous women with disabilities, which is a very relevant and important for Indigenous women and women with disabilities. And at the questions, as you have mentioned, what I can do as an MRIP member, how I see. As you have mentioned about this in the topic, participation, let me say first from the point of the mandate of the MRIP. From my personal view, one is that participation of Indigenous peoples is one of the oldest issues for Indigenous peoples movement. And that's for the inclusive and effective and meaningful participation on the matter affect to them. So the decision making on the full spectrum of matters that affect their lives forms the fundamental basis for the enjoyment of the full range of human rights. So as a MRIP mandate is to provide the Human Rights Council with expertise and advice on the rights of Indigenous peoples as set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And also the mandate talk about assisting member states in achieving the ends of the declaration through the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of the rights of Indigenous peoples. It also elaborated to identify the need for and providing technical advice regarding the development of domestic legislation and policies relating to the rights of Indigenous peoples. And also, it also said for assistance and advice for the implementation of recommendations made the Universal Periodic Review and by treaty bodies, special procedures or other relevant mechanisms. It also said that indigenous peoples and or other the private sector engaging and assisting them by facilitating dialogue when agreeable to all parties in order to achieve the ends of the declaration. The mandate also said to identify, disseminate, and promote good practices and lessons learned, the efforts to achieve the ends of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including through submitting reports to the Human Rights Council. And then based on that, if we see how UN Declaration also provides a space for the participation, the declaration contained more than 20 provisions affirming indigenous peoples' rights to participate in decision making. Articulated as inter alia, 1, the right to self-determination, the right to autonomy or self-government, indigenous peoples' right to participate, their right to be actively involved, states' duty to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent, the duty to seek free agreement with indigenous peoples, the duty to consult and cooperate with indigenous peoples, the duty to undertake measures in conjunction with indigenous peoples, and the duty to pay due respect to the customs of indigenous peoples. This underscores that indigenous people's right to participation is the core principle and right under international human rights law. So by saying that, the opportunity for the here, integration, indigenous women and their participation, particularly the disabilities women based on the priorities, is an area actually we can have a look. And if also you see that MDIP has been conducted studies and reports last more than 12 years since its inception. In every recommendations and in the reports, provided the issue and the situation of indigenous women and women with disabilities. What we can do is, it's actually we cannot do alone. We have to do together, like how we can approach the member states to implement those recommendations made by the MRIL. Because these reports has already adopted by the Human Rights Council, and Human Rights Council is the intergovernmental body. That means the government has already approached and accepted it. So now how we can make it realize at the domestic level? In this regard, we need to work together. I think what MDIP has done at the international level, that needs to be grounded through the indigenous people organizations, and NIDWAN has a best way to really also look into this. How can we do in the regional level and also national level in Nepal? And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Binota, for your presentation and your inputs and highlighting on the mandate of MRIP as well as promoting the collective effort. I'd like to request all our participants, if you have any questions for Mr. Binota, then please post it on the chat box. It will be responded in the following Q&A session. I'd like to thank all our speakers for their inputs, and now I'd like to open the second round of Q&A session, where our participants will put forward their questions if they have any to our speakers and their inputs. So I'd like to open up the Q&A session and request all our participants to, if any of you have any questions for our participants, then please put the questions in the chat box. I think we have received a question for Miss Carla Bush and to our Binota sir. Okay, I would like to first go to Miss Carla Bush. So in the chat box, we can see the question from Mila. How can we ensure that funding support prioritizes the most marginalized groups like women with disability to unify them and be flexible in the funding support? Please, I would like you to respond on that.
Thank you for the question. It's very simple. In our program, it is one of our priority already, women and disability. And we have, as you may not know, but one of the things that we do is that our funding goes through a process of cycling. So every cycle, every year, at the beginning of the year, we define the topics that the grant cycle will be. So that could go from food security to health issue to agriculture, economical issue, either ones. And within that, it's not limited. It's broad. So programs and projects can fit into them easily. And as you know, these are not open calls. They're closed. They're calls that you access one of or any one of the members of the Pawanka Board of Directors. So you know, once the call are there, you access them, and there are people there are Indigenous people from the communities, which we all know them, and you access them. If you don't, then I'm more than happy to share the list of members and their contacts so that you could reach them. And then you always go through, because we fund Indigenous organizations, you know, and so you in your case, you will go to Newa, who is one of our partners as well. You can access and present the project through them, or whoever you consider fit to go, and go up to the members of the Pawanka board for them. As I said, it is a priority, and I don't foresee any difficulties in accessing the resources for that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your response. I think that answers the question. Now I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Binotaji. Mr. Binota sir, the question is from Kadambini Guru. She has asked, how can we develop an enabling environment to have a report prepared from MRIP on women with disabilities? I ask you to respond that.
Okay. Thank you so much for the questions. Your questions actually, I'll say, I think you are referring how you can contribute submitting a report to the MRIP. Actually, it's open for any Indigenous peoples organizations to prepare and submit a report to the MRIP based on the theme identified for the year. For example, as I mentioned in my speech, every year we have one study and advice and one report. We prepare as MRIP. These two issues, those two thematic issues, we collect a report from report or input, whatever you say, from the worldwide, from different organizations, institutions. Particularly, we encourage Indigenous peoples organizations to engage with the MRIP in this report submission and also through the activities that we do. So here, women with disabilities also can submit a report in the MRIP based on the themes that we identified for the study and for the report. And for the next year, now we have recently concluded our MRIP annual session last month, and we discussed and decided our next study. One is the treaties, agreement, and constructive arrangement with the states and Indigenous peoples. And the other one, the report, is the militarization. And I think you have the good opportunity also to prepare a report based on these two thematic areas on the militarization and treaties, agreements, or any constructive arrangement you have done where Indigenous people's human rights are either improved or deteriorated something, whatever it is, but you can submit a report in connection with this thematic issue as well as in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that's one of the important thing. But also the second important thing is actually once we are done with this report, we also produce advice and recommendations for the member states, for the indigenous peoples, for the UN agencies. That's the important how you can connect these recommendations to into the ground level at the domestic level for the implementation phase, also engaging the MRIP to this process. So this is the both way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for your response. Now we have another question from Ms. Kakai. The question is from Jamuna Tamang, and the question is, how can your role as Newa member facilitate in strengthening the network of women with disability across Asia? I'd request you to respond on that. And please keep your response short. We are running out of time, so thank you.
Yes, regarding the question, as far as Newa is concerned, Newa is a newly established network of indigenous women in Asia that compose of 11 organizations. It aims to organize, consolidate, and rendered services of capacity building on its membership. So regarding on the inclusion of NIDWAN in the Newa, still we are having at the stage of steering committee. So in principles, we cannot regret on the application of NIDWAN to as a member, to be a member in Newa, because Newa is also aiming that all the indigenous women, even with disabilities, must be united and be one in pursuing our rights as indigenous women, in owning our struggle stories and struggles on a certain assertion of our rights as indigenous women to land resources and self-determination. So we encourage NIDWAN just to have a communication with Newa, especially in the level of steering committee, so that we can work together what is the space we can create for the indigenous women with disabilities in Nepal. So that is only the what the Newa can say now, because Miss Pratima is always communicating also with our focal persons in Newa. So it is good that NIDWAN send application of interest for Newa membership. So for that cost, indigenous women with disabilities must be inclusive in Newa programs and services, so that no indigenous women left behind.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your response. Now, because of time limitations, I would like to conclude the question and answer session. We have one question from Ms. Carla. So opening the recommendation session as well, I would like to request Ms. Carla to respond on the question as well as put your 2 concrete points on how to ensure meaningful participation of women with disability. And the question for you is, how Pawanka grant can access in time of emergency, like enforced displacement of IPs, communities, and individual, subject for illegal search, illegal arrest, and detained with trumped-up charges, particularly in Philippines indigenous peoples. So with this question, I would like to request Ms. Carla to respond on the question as well as put forward her two concrete points to ensure the meaningful participation of women with disability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. It's very simply processed. You know that we went through this COVID situation. Pawanka Board of Director made changes, strategic changes, so that we could have a program, a line program of emergency, which is open across the year. There is no cycle for the emergency project. So if you have a grant that is related to emergency, you could submit it on the same procedure to the board members. You don't have to wait for the cycles to open to do that. So if you have an emergency now, you submit it immediately to any of the 10 members that we have, and that would be considered. It even have a different procedure. We created a very speedy procedure so that the most it takes in processing the whole grant payment, everything that you have to get back your bank, the transfer, it takes like 15 days. That's the maximum. And we try to make it speedier because we have to go as well to our sponsor for this. But we have made tremendous changes to adjust that. So anytime, to answer your question, and just embrace our members for that. And
Yes.
then to my recommendation, I have two because that's what they ask us for. So I would first recommend the major organizations like the UN, the IPAS, the UNDP, the UNFFI to host discussion for the exchange of knowledge and good practices on ways to increase and strengthen their representation, the representations of disability and a woman and people with disability in decision-making space at all levels. That would be my first recommendation. So let me just be clear. It's recommend multilateral regional organizations to please host discussion for the exchange of knowledge and good practices towards ways to increase and strengthen the representation of Indigenous women and people with disability in decision-making spaces at all levels. That's very important. And obviously to our partner, we would like to recommend if they could continue to collaborate, if they could continue to collaborate with all actors to advocate for mainstreaming of disability issues in different programs and to support their learning about the rights of persons with disability. This is very, very important. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be
Thank
here.
you. Thank you, Ms. Carla. Thank you for your recommendation. Now I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Ms. Pratima Gurung, for your two concrete points to ensure meaningful participation of women with disabilities.
Thank you, Pema. So I will just highlight not two, I will just go to 4 recommendations that I have. So I would say being a woman with disabilities, our right to dignified life and right to self-determination is crucial for us at all levels. So in this regard, I would say to all our brothers, sisters, funders, partners, government, and all the UN agencies, listen to us, listen our stories, listen our challenges, and with the challenges, we can provide solutions to you, how we can collectively move forward. The second thing that I wanted to highlight is about social inclusion and accessibility needs for person with disabilities. So in that regard, I would say sign language interpretation for deaf people, personal attendance for those who are severe and profound disability, and many other disability needs are very much primary for us. So those needs should be very much fundamental for ensuring the meaningful participation of people with disabilities and women with disabilities. And in that regard, I would also like to highlight that since we lack evidences, the UN agencies, we know that Binota is here as an expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people, as a MRIP member. Documentations is very crucial for us, research, finding, for the evidence advocacy, which is very much crucial at all the levels to highlight our challenges and issues that we have. When it comes to funder, I would say priority and also support for the programmatic and institutional support is very much required from the funder perspective. When it comes to strengthening the network of women with disabilities, I would say that the network, unification, collaboration, consultations, and keeping women with disabilities in center is priority. So I would like to request my sister Kakay also to strengthen the network of women with disabilities across Asia. It's not only Nepal, it's Asia, and we want to envision this network not only in Asia, within the 7 geopolitical regions of this world. So I would say that these are the very key fundamental things that we have to initiate, and we hope all your collaboration in coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pratima Gurung, for your recommendations. And now I'd like to move on to Ms. Kakay for your 2 concrete points to ensure the meaningful participation.
For the
Ms.
matter
Kakay?
asked, yes. For the matter asked, maybe all indigenous women with disabilities must be first recognized by the government on their country, and the services and programs of the government must be particular for indigenous women with disabilities. So this is the objective of Newa, to be carried along the way, that Newa is consolidating her ranks with the indigenous women with disabilities. So the principle is to make spaces and collective actions as a must, because indigenous women with disabilities must be is on exist, resist, and that's it. Indigenous women must exist and resist.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Now I'd like to move on to Mr. Binoda for your 2 concrete points to ensure meaningful participation of women with disabilities.
Thank you once again. I was listening other recommendations. I'm really, I have to say that all the recommendations, the points have made by Pratima, Carla, and Kakay, which is so much important and very much relevant and very straightforward. And with that, what I like to say is, from my point of view, particularly, is 2 things is very important. First is the recognition. To what level recognitions actually we have now for the indigenous women with disabilities. So this is one of the most important part that we need to see from every sectors. So it is, one is that the recognition from the government level. To what extent actually government has the recognition to these indigenous women with disabilities. So then the second point is the recognition also by the so-called also the indigenous peoples organizations itself, and also the international organizations, how extent they have provided space. So this is the important part. So this is, we have to actually work, though it is a long process and political process, this is the area we need to work for the recognitions. So after the recognition, the then most important part is coming up with the inclusiveness to all the processes, then coming with the participation in the decision-making process. So after the recognition, though it is a political process, but at at least we can start educating why inclusiveness is important for the indigenous women with disabilities in all the processes, or working with all the organizations. Until or unless if it is not inclusiveness and excluded them from the process, then the voice will never be heard. So this is, I see as an important area to work. And now for the UN expert bodies, for example, say we have two main UN mechanisms. One is the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Another one is expert mechanism. To what extent those mechanisms are providing the space, listening the voices of indigenous women with disabilities. This also matter to see, and also to continue the collaboration and a conversation on this process. And the second point is also the same thing, the participation at the international level. The UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, to what extent they can carry out their roles and responsibilities, providing the space for the indigenous women with disabilities, or the indigenous peoples with disabilities, whatever it is, at least the space for them, in order to make sure that their participation at the international level is there. So this is one of the things we can see. So I see from the ground, and perhaps we can also continue this discussion and to see the area of engagement, how effectively we can do this. And of course, while we say all this, definitely indigenous people organizations has some responsibilities to give or open up the space, including the donor agencies. Like in Nepal, also there are so many UN agencies. They are talking about the sustainable development goals. To be honest, I was following some of these SDG processes, but I hardly see the spaces for the disabilities there. Even the Asia Pacific region, this sustainable development goal process. So we say we are talking no one left behind. But on the other hand, we are not providing the space to all the sectors of the communities, including indigenous peoples, these indigenous women with disabilities.
Yes, sir.
So this is always the important area that we need to say. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to once again thank all our distinguished speakers for putting forth their very insightful recommendations. And now, as we are already running out of time, I'd like to conclude our session today. First of all, I'd like to thank all our distinguished speakers, all the participants who have joined today for the 1 hour, to have here with us, to hear the voices of our speakers and to put forth their questions and queries. Now it's listening to all our speakers, we have realized known that the participation of women with disabilities is very crucial, as spoken by our speaker, Ms. Kakai and Ms. Pratima. Their spaces, their role is essential for our and the overall development. And as the hope presented by our developmental partners, Ms. Carla and Mr. Binota, your presentation and your voices, your inputs gives us hope that yes, our voices are not completely not heard, and yes, we have a mandate and we have spaces for our participation, and yes, our partners are listening to our voices and they do ensure our participation. So with being said that, I'd like to thank all the speakers, our language interpreter and our sign language interpreter for making the session inclusive for all. And we'd like to thank all our participation for giving us time and joining with us in this collective effort to ensure the meaningful participation of women with disability and the most marginalized community. With this, I'd like to conclude our session and I would like to congratulate again for our very successful Second World Conference on Indigenous Women and a very happy 27th International Day on Indigenous People. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, we would like
Thank
to
you all.
say this because this is for our deaf participants. We are
Yes.
saying thank you for them. This is how we do with two hands, because I have single hand, so you have to do two hands. This is what we say to our deaf participants, and we are very thankful for all of you. Thank you for joining us, Carla,
Thank you.
Kakay, and
Thank
Binota.
you,
Thank you for
everyone.
all
Thank
your
you,
remarks, and to all our
sister.
interpreters
Thank
and sign
you,
language.
Binota,
And
Miss
also thank you.
Carla. Bye.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
And Pima,
Bye.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.